All right, good afternoon. Welcome to the Foreign Press Center. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Mark Zimmer. I'm one of the media relations officers here. Today we have three briefers offering us a preview of President Obama's travel to the G20 summit, the Philippines, and Malaysia. Our three briefers, from the middle, Mr. Daniel Kritenbrink, who is the Senior Director for Asian Affairs at the National Security Council. On the far side, Mr. Rory McFarquhar, who is Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for International Economics. On my immediate right is Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Daniel Russell. Each will offer an opening statement, and then we'll open it up for questions. We have colleagues in New York joining us. We'll take questions from there if they come to the podium. Thank you again for joining us, Mr. Kritenbrink.
Great. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be back at the Foreign Press Center. Again, I'm Dan Kritenbrink. I'm Senior Director for Asian Affairs, and I really appreciate your coming out today and for showing interest in the President's rebalance strategy to the Asia Pacific. It's been a very busy year for our engagement with the region, and I think that reality is represented by the fact that the President has met in Washington with 5 Asian leaders this year: Japanese Prime Minister Abe, Vietnamese General Secretary Chong, Chinese President Xi, South Korean President Park, and Indonesian President Widodo. As a further demonstration of the importance of our rebalance strategy, today we're here to talk about the President's 9th trip to Asia. So this afternoon I plan to briefly walk you through the planned events for the President's trip to Manila and Kuala Lumpur. I want to situate the trip within our broader rebalance strategy, and then I'll ask my colleagues, Senior Director Rory McFarquhar and Assistant Secretary Danny Russell, to highlight some of our priorities for APEC, EAS, and the ASEAN meetings. So first, a few comments on the program for the President in the region. On Tuesday, November 17, the President will arrive in Manila from Turkey, where he will have attended the G20 meetings. Shortly after his arrival, the President will spend his first event focused on our alliance with the Philippines and our maritime security assistance to the region. This event will include a visit to a Philippine naval ship, where the President will meet with U.S. and Filipino sailors and senior Filipino defense officials. The event will showcase U.S. maritime security assistance to the region. Later that day, the President will hold a bilat with Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull of the Commonwealth of Australia. This will be their first meeting, and their agenda will be extensive given the close cooperation we have with Australia on everything from the Counter-ISIL Coalition to maritime security to TPP. On Wednesday, November 18, in the morning, the President will hold a bilateral meeting with President Aquino of the Philippines, where he plans to address a number of issues important to our alliance, while also congratulating President Aquino on the Philippines' hosting of APEC. Later in the morning, the President will deliver remarks at a CEO summit. In the afternoon, the President will participate in a meeting on the Trans-Pacific Partnership with counterparts from the other 11 TPP member countries. Later in the afternoon, the President will participate in a Pacific Alliance meeting, and leaders from the 21 APEC countries as well as Colombia will attend. In the evening, the President will attend an APEC welcome dinner and cultural performance. On Thursday, November 19, the day's events on the 19th will be focused on APEC itself. Then in the evening, the President will participate in a bilateral meeting with Prime Minister Abe of Japan. This will be the first meeting between Prime Minister Abe and the President since the Prime Minister's official visit to Washington in April. They'll discuss a range of regional and global issues reflective of our very close alliance. On Friday, November 20, the President will fly to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and upon arrival in KL, the President will participate in a Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative, or YSEALI Town Hall, to support our strong people-to-people ties in the region. The President and Prime Minister Najib of Malaysia will then hold a bilat that evening, and the two leaders are likely to discuss a number of areas of mutual interest, from maritime security cooperation to our successful conclusion of the TPP, while of course also highlighting Malaysia's successful year as chair of ASEAN. On Saturday, November 21, before the ASEAN and EAS programs in KL begin, the President will visit a refugee center at which an NGO is offering education and vocational training to some of the more than 150,000 refugees living in Malaysia. Malaysia has played a positive role supporting this large refugee population and responding to acute refugee crises like the one earlier this year in the region. The President will highlight our shared responsibility to help refugees, as well as U.S. support to refugees and displaced persons worldwide. In the evening, The President will meet briefly with Prime Minister Thein Sein of Laos. We will offer our full support to Laos as it takes on the chairmanship of ASEAN next year. The President will then participate in a U.S.-ASEAN summit meeting. Finally, he will end the day of the 21st by attending the East Asia Summit dinner and cultural performance. Then on the final day of the trip on November 22nd, the President will participate in the East Asia Summit meeting. The President will then hold a bilateral meeting with Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong of the Republic of Singapore, and they will of course address the broad range of cooperation between our two countries on economic and security issues reflective of our close partnership. The President will hold a concluding press conference that day, and then we will begin the trip back home. So after reviewing the schedule, if I could make just a couple of comments on the overall context for the President's trip to the region. As I mentioned at the top, this will be the President's 9th trip to the region. It's an opportunity to build on our recent achievements and demonstrate the strength of the President's rebalance strategy. At its heart, the rebalance is about building a rules-based order in Asia, in which all countries pursue their national interests and their prosperity peacefully. We are working to strengthen shared norms, principles, and values that offer everyone in the region an equal footing, irrespective of their size or strength. The President's strategy is grounded in the fact that the Asia-Pacific region is increasingly the world's political and economic center of gravity, with profound implications for U.S. national interests. The trip will reflect the United States' comprehensive approach to our rebalance strategy and will highlight our commitments to stronger economic, security, and people-to-people ties. One of the top themes for the trip will be the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and how it will tie the United States even closer to the region. TPP is central to our vision of the region's future and our place in it. This agreement represents years of negotiation encompassing countries that today account for nearly 40% of the world's GDP, and puts in place historic labor and environmental standards that will ensure our trading partners play by high standard rules and values. TPP will also play an important role in revitalizing the open rules-based economic system that has underpinned America's and the region's economic growth. Our agenda at APEC similarly advances our vision for a rules-based economic system, and I'll let my colleague Rory McFarquhar fill you in on the details of our top APEC priorities. Regarding the other summits in KL, namely the U.S.-ASEAN Summit and the East Asia Summit, the President will continue to make the case for the importance of a rules-based international order in the political and security realms, with a special emphasis on issues such as maritime and cyber. The President's participation in these summits demonstrates our commitment to strengthening the region's institutions so that the rules of the road in Asia reflect the broad aspirations of the region as a whole. This is a particularly significant year for the region's institutions. The East Asia Summit will celebrate its 10th year as the region's premier leader-level forum to address political and security issues. ASEAN will launch its ASEAN community, including the ASEAN Economic Community. We've worked together with other EAS member countries on a number of statements focused on regional challenges. And with our friends in ASEAN, we plan to outline new ways that we will enhance the U.S.-ASEAN partnership, and I believe Assistant Secretary Russell will give you further detail on those objectives. As I mentioned in my overview of the trip program, the President will confer with a number of our close allies and partners on the margins of these summits through his bilateral meetings. These engagements will focus on our shared regional priorities and the global challenges that our Asia partners are tackling together. A number of events outside conference rooms will highlight other elements of our rebalance. For example, the event with the Philippine Navy will underscore our commitment to assisting the region with stronger maritime security capabilities. The President will meet with young leaders in the region under the auspices of his successful YSEALI program. In fact, since YSEALI was launched in 2013, nearly 50,000 youth from across Southeast Asia have joined and are advancing their work as young leaders in their countries with a focus on civic engagement, economic empowerment, and environmental stewardship. The President will also demonstrate that the rebalance includes our commitment to supporting the rights and dignity of all those living in the region. For example, he'll visit a refugee center to highlight the region's positive efforts to support and accommodate refugees and ways the United States supports these efforts as the largest donor to the UNHCR and is the largest host of resettled refugees. He also looks forward to opportunities to demonstrate our support for the important role played by vibrant civil societies, both across the region and around the world. And climate change will, of course, remain a focus throughout the trip as we transition to the Paris Climate Conference just 2 weeks later. So with that, I'd like now to first turn to my colleague Rory McFarquhar to talk about our economic priorities on the trip and APEC, and after that, then ask my colleague Danny Russell to explain further the strategic context for the trip. Thank you. Rory?
Thank you, Dan, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. My name is Rory McFarquhar. I'm the Senior Director for Global Economics and Finance at the National Security Council. I'd like to say a few words, first of all, about the President's agenda at the G20, and then about our priorities for the APEC meetings. On November 15th and 16th, President Obama will participate in the G20 Leaders Summit in Antalya, Turkey. This is the 10th G20 Leaders Summit and President Obama's 9th since taking office. The G20, as you know, is the world's premier forum for global economic policy cooperation, where leaders representing about 85% of global GDP assemble with the overarching goal of promoting strong, sustainable, and balanced global growth. The first day of the summit will include a working lunch on development and climate change, followed by a working session on the global economy, employment, and investment, and a dinner session on global challenges. The second day of the session will begin with a working session on enhancing the resilience of the global economy through financial regulation, international tax policy, and anti-corruption measures. This will be followed by a working lunch on trade and energy. Let me highlight just a few themes we expect to emerge from the summit. The first is that despite the solid and sustained economic recovery in the United States, the pace of overall global growth is disappointing. And as you will have seen in the Financial Times this morning, this is an issue that President Obama is very focused on, and he'll be working to galvanize global action around creating jobs, investing in infrastructure and research, and putting more money in the pockets of middle-class consumers to spend and drive growth. The second key theme that you'll see in the G20 is to continue its work that began in 2008 and 2009 to rebuild the global financial system on a more resilient footing. We expect leaders to endorse a new global standard on the total loss-absorbing capacity of systemically important banks, a key step in addressing the problem of too big to fail. We also expect leaders to endorse a set of recommendations to address tax avoidance by multinational corporations. These two major outcomes reflect years of work and are an indication that the G20 is making progress in closing the gaps in the international regulatory architecture that existed before the financial crisis. The third key issue is climate change. The summit comes just a few weeks, as Dan said, before the Paris Climate Conference, and we expect that G20 leaders will send a strong signal of their support for an ambitious and durable outcome in Paris, as well as to advance the G20's ongoing work on energy access and efficiency. Turning to APEC, on November 18th and 19th, President Obama will participate in the APEC leaders meeting in Manila. This is the 23rd APEC leaders meeting and the 5th the President will attend since taking office. APEC, as you know, is the leading forum in the Asia-Pacific for economic policy cooperation, where leaders representing almost 60% of global GDP assemble to advance policies that strengthen trade and investment, foster sustainable and balanced economic growth, and deepen regional cooperation. The President is looking forward to seeing his fellow APEC leaders, and the President's participation in APEC reflects not only the U.S. commitment to the region, but the importance we place on fostering an open, rules-based economic system that supports American prosperity and that has contributed to the rapid growth of the Asia-Pacific region. As Dan mentioned, on November 18th, the President will participate in two APEC leaders' retreats. The morning session will focus on strengthening the regional and global economies and advancing regional economic and financial integration. The afternoon session will focus on issues related to fostering sustainable and resilient communities, including human capital, health, disaster resilience, and climate change. Let me highlight a few themes that we expect to see at APEC. First is the continued importance of fostering policies that promote trade and investment. Expanded trade can fuel economic growth, facilitate investment, spur development, and reduce poverty. APEC will launch new work on services and digital trade, areas of strength for the U.S. economy. It will redouble its efforts to improve the ease of doing business in the region by cutting red tape, making supply chains more efficient, and promoting structural reforms to stimulate growth and create opportunities for U.S. business. The second theme is the importance of taking steps to protect our environment, including by addressing climate change. APEC continues to advance its work to reduce inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, promote the development of electric vehicles, reduce the energy intensity of economic activity, and boost the use of renewable fuels. In addition, APEC is working to realize our leaders' commitment to reduce or eliminate tariffs on environmental goods by the end of 2015. The third theme is the importance of building sustainable and resilient communities. APEC is helping to bolster disaster resiliency by developing the APEC principles for the movement of humanitarian goods and equipment in times of emergencies, which will help remove bottlenecks at the border to make goods available faster and restore commerce as quickly as possible. APEC is also working to combat infectious disease through the Global Health Security Agenda, to halt the spread of counterfeit medicines, to seek ways to reduce and eliminate barriers to trade in healthcare products, and to ensure the safety of the blood supply. Finally, the trip will also highlight the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, as Dan mentioned. As you know, we concluded negotiations with 11 other countries on October 5th. In Manila, the President will participate in a meeting with his TPP leader counterparts. This will be the first time that leaders of the TPP countries will come together since the completion of negotiations and the publication of the text of the agreement. So leaders will have an opportunity to mark this enormous progress and to demonstrate their shared commitment to moving forward with domestic processes in order to quickly ratify and implement TPP. The President will also address TPP during his visit to Kuala Lumpur. Malaysia is, of course, a member of TPP, so the President will discuss certain elements of the agreement with Prime Minister Najib, as well as deliver remarks to underscore the benefits of TPP to further regional integration. Thank you.
Thanks. Look, as you just heard, this trip in a nutshell covers the broad span of the Asia rebalance: economic engagement, strategic and security issues, strengthening alliances, working with others to meet global challenges, institution building, strengthening adherence to universal values and good governance, building people-to-people ties. So it showcases America's success in rebalancing towards Asia. Now, I will pick up in Manila, where the Deputy Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, along with U.S. Trade Representative Mike Froman, will represent the U.S. at the ministerial that precedes APEC, precedes the leaders' meeting while the G20 is still underway. And on APEC, what I'd add to what Rory just said is that we're building on a quarter century of achievement in APEC, lowering tariffs across the region, promoting green growth, speeding people through airports with...
Pardon me, sir, your microphone's not working. Can we just give you this?
Sure.
Thank you.
Speeding people through airports with APEC business travel cards. It's a particularly important meeting in light of TPP, which in fact traces its lineage back to APEC, as do many other important trade initiatives. And the TPP deal now means that the rest of APEC has a blueprint for economic integration that the other economies can and should and frankly will have to aspire to. We also in Manila have important bilateral work to do with the Philippines. This is a close ally, it's a close friend, it's an important partner. The Philippines is a thriving democracy with a fast-growing economy and very deep historic ties to the United States. So the visit will further strengthen our alliance cooperation, our ability to maintain regional stability, and our ability to respond more quickly to disasters. Now, the South China Sea as an issue isn't on the APEC agenda. The leaders typically use the East Asia Summit later to engage on the priority strategic and security problems in the region. But it is obviously a topic of bilateral conversation with the Philippine government. The visit takes place against the backdrop of tensions in the South China Sea caused by the massive reclamation and construction in the Spratlys, and the threat of militarization of the outposts. It also follows on the heels of a recent decision by the Law of the Sea Arbitral Tribunal to hear the Philippines-China case on maritime rights. And my understanding is those hearings are expected to begin later this month. Next, I'll turn to the EAS, the East Asia Summit in Kuala Lumpur. The EAS is a very important part of U.S. strategy to promote a rules-based region, as Dan mentioned. It brings together leaders of the most relevant nations to engage in substantive discussions of pressing strategic issues. It allows regional partners like the U.S. and Japan, like China and Russia, like Australia and New Zealand, like India and Korea, to partner with ASEAN and each other in working through priorities and meeting challenges. That makes it the region's principal political and security forum. And because 2015 marks its 10th anniversary, I think you'll see a consensus to strengthen the EAS and to bolster its work. The leaders will discuss maritime cooperation, which is essential for economic development and environmental protection. They will discuss maritime security and challenges to maritime rights and to free navigation in the South China Sea. And because ensuring an open, secure internet is vital to the region's future, the leaders will continue their discussions on cyber issues. And you should expect them also to focus on countering violent extremism, on health security, and on other pressing issues. Now, the President, as Dan mentioned, will also hold a summit with the 10 ASEAN leaders, as he has done each year since taking office. He signed the Treaty of Amity and Commerce. He appointed an ambassador. He launched the Waisili Youth Initiative. The Secretary of State meets with the ASEAN 10 foreign ministers at least twice every year. And we're now ready to take our relationship with ASEAN to the next level. This is particularly relevant given the Burmese elections that just took place this past weekend. In the previous administration, and for the first few years of this one, our engagement with ASEAN was nearly all about pressuring the Burmese generals to make reforms and also worrying about the prospect that Burma would take over the chairmanship of ASEAN. But our relationship with ASEAN has benefited from and has helped to foster the reform process in Burma. For years, as I mentioned, the Burma problem is what we discussed with ASEAN. But by 2014, Burma had been transformed to the point that it could credibly and did credibly chair ASEAN. So last week, when the Burmese people held an historic election, they did it in a way that was peaceful, that was competitive, that was generally well run, and with a remarkable outcome. Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD appear to have won a decisive victory. And President Thein Sein and the head of the Burmese military have reiterated their public pledges to honor the election results and to support a smooth transfer of power. The hard part is still ahead. There are many complicated steps left in the political process, but the Burmese people have crossed a historic milestone, and I believe that the meetings with ASEAN will help lift up that significance. Now, in addition to a continued discussion on the South China Sea, the U.S.-ASEAN meeting will also discuss climate change. The ASEAN members are particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And following through on the pledge that they made at last year's summit, most ASEAN members have already submitted their emissions reduction pledges, and therefore this meeting can help make progress at the Paris conference. Now, we have a good relationship with the host country, Malaysia. We appreciate its leadership in ASEAN, in TPP, in assisting refugees, in combating terrorism and violent extremism, and in other areas. But we will, as we always do, take this opportunity to speak frankly, as friends should, about our concerns over human rights and the curtailment of political space. To sum it up, as a result of our rebalance and because we've established such a strong set of relationships across the region, we can develop, we can act on a broad and ambitious agenda at APEC, at EAS, and with ASEAN. That's the new normal that benefits America, that benefits our Asia-Pacific partners, and benefits the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you. Thanks. He's going to trade your microphone, sir. We'll open it up for questions and answers now. As always, please identify yourself and your outlet. If you're addressing a particular briefer, please say so. If any guests in New York come to the podium, we'll address their questions. So let's start in the front, please.
Jennifer Chen, reporter with Shenzhen Media Group. I would like to know, how do you anticipate the interaction atmosphere between Chinese presidency and President Obama? And also, what is the necessity for U.S. to put the South China Sea topic in the meetings? And what's the intentions for the two U.S. bombers flew over artificial Chinese-built island in the South China Sea? And is that an innocent passage? Thank you very much.
Could I take an initial stab at you? You first asked about interactions between the United States and China at the meetings. I would just say a couple of things. First of all, excuse me. First of all, there's no formal bilateral schedule between President Obama and President Xi, in large part because, as you know, they just had a very successful state visit here in Washington at the end of September, in which President Xi visited, and our two leaders had an opportunity to have very candid and constructive discussions that I think represent the balanced approach that we take to our relationship with China. As you know, we're committed to maximizing cooperation with China on a whole host of common global challenges, at the same time that we work to very candidly confront and manage the many differences that exist between us. And I think as you see the events unfold in Manila and at KL, I think you'll see the U.S.-China interaction taking place along those lines, along a whole range of issues. There are many areas where we cooperate very closely with our Chinese friends, and there are areas where we have differences. We don't paper over those differences. We speak candidly about them, and I think that's what you'll see on the ground. You asked about why the United States focuses on the South China Sea. Let me say just a couple of comments about that. We are not claimants in the South China Sea. We do not take a position on the various competing territorial claims. What we do take a position on is the importance of a rules-based international order where all countries, big and small, act in accordance with the same rules. And so for the United States, we see that as a fundamental national interest. And other fundamental national interests that we see at stake include freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight, unimpeded commerce throughout those waters, and peaceful resolution of disputes. So our activities and our positions and our speaking out on these issues have nothing to do with trying to challenge various sovereignty claims, again, which we don't take a position on. They have everything to do with our taking a position on upholding these larger principles.
Let me add one point, if I may.
Please.
Let's ask ourselves, in the South China Sea, what's new, what's not new? What's unique, what's common practice? Now, you asked about planes flying in the vicinity of the South China Sea. That's not new. The United States sails and flies through international water, international space, all over the world, including the South China Sea. The South China Sea is not an exception. What's new, however, has been in the last year and a half, the unprecedented destruction of coral reefs, the reclamation of something in the order of 3,000 acres, the construction of super long runways, and the risk, certainly, of militarization. That's new, and it's troubling. What's unique? What's common practice? Well, it is common practice for nations to sail through international waters and, at times, to transit territorial waters of others. certainly this is a right that China exercises. China's free to exercise it. China's welcome to exercise it. What's unique is an attempt to carve out security zones or portions of the sea that are closed to international traffic and international commerce. And that would constitute a real problem. So it's important to differentiate along those lines the flight of a B-52, the transit of a warship, if it is not new, if it's not unique, and if it's consistent with international law, isn't news.
Let's do one more in the front, Jane, please, and then we'll move backwards.
Thank you, Mark. Hi, Jane with Sina News in China. KMT Chairman Dr. Zhu has said that the goal is the stable relation between U.S., China, and Taiwan. So do you find this triangle is being balanced after Xi and Ma's meeting? And are you surprised of this meeting? Thank you.
Maybe I can take an initial crack at that. We welcome the meeting between President Xi and President Ma. We also welcome the historic improvement that we've seen in cross-strait relations over the last several years. For the United States, we have a deep and abiding interest in peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. That's where we focus our interests. We encourage further progress by both sides towards building those ties so they can reduce tensions and promote stability on the basis of dignity and respect. So I think those are the interests that we see at stake. We welcome the meeting. We welcome further development of cross-strait relations, and we're going to maintain our longstanding and consistent One China policy, which is based, as you know, both on the 3 joint communiques and the Taiwan Relations Act. Surprised? I don't really have a comment. I simply would say we welcome the meeting, and we welcome any step that promotes cross-strait relations in a manner that's acceptable to the peoples on both sides of the strait.
Do we have a follow-up?
Let's okay, we'll let Nadia, please.
Hi, Nadia Chao with the Liberty Times Taiwan. Just follow up. Chairman Chu just visited Washington. I believe both Danny has met Chairman Chu. So did you find that there were more information provided by Mr. Chu regarding the meeting between Ma and Xi? Do you think this is, leave actually less flexibility between Taiwan and China in the future if the opposition party got elected? And do you got any new information from Mr. Chu? Thank you.
Well, look, our conversations with the KMT candidate for office in the upcoming elections in Taiwan focused on policy. We have an open door to major political actors from Taiwan, and want to underscore that, contrary to speculation in the Taiwan press, we treat both representatives from the KMT and the DPP with an equal degree of access, with even-handed treatment. We don't play favorites. It's for the voters on Taiwan to decide who their favorite is. So we don't back parties, but we do care about policies. And these visits have created an opportunity for us to consult, confer, and discuss policy issues with the head of the KMT, as it did with the head of the DPP earlier on. I think the real point is that we have strong unofficial ties based on our deep respect for Taiwan's democracy, based on our interest and stake in Taiwan's security and freedom from coercion, based on our economic interests, and those are considerable economic interests, and based on our support for an appropriate level of access for Taiwan in the international arena and international space. So the focus of our conversation was in the context of our One China policy, how our unofficial relations can develop and how the stability of the cross-straits can be sustained and how tensions there can be reduced. So I think it was definitely a constructive set of exchanges.
All right,
Could I add just a couple of points? I completely agree with everything Danny said. I just wanted to underscore a couple of things that Danny mentioned. One, we welcome Chairman Zhu's visit. Our conversations with him were productive. Number two, we received Chairman Zhu in exactly the same way that we received DPP presidential candidate Tsai Ing-wen during her visit to Washington in June. We met both candidates at exactly the same level. And thirdly, just to emphasize and underscore what Danny said, we will not take sides in the election. The outcome of Taiwan's election is a matter for the people of Taiwan to decide. We respect Taiwan's robust democracy. We look forward to working with whomever the people of Taiwan choose as their next leader.
Okay, we'll move to the middle, please. Then we'll go to New York in the brown jacket, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Tatsuya Mizumoto from Jiji Press. I would like to ask about U.S.-Japan leaders meeting Manila on 19th. What is our main agenda? And then do you think the president will urge Prime Minister Abe to resolve historical issue with Korea? Thank you very much.
Sure, I'll take an initial grab at that. I think the president is very much looking forward to his meeting with Prime Minister Abe. I think you can expect a very robust and broad agenda that's reflective of our longstanding and very close alliance. I'm sure that we'll talk about increased security cooperation between us in accordance with our revised guidelines. I'm sure they'll have a conversation about the security context in the region, including on maritime issues. I'm confident that they'll talk about the need to implement and ratify the TPP, which is reflective of our close economic and trade relations. And finally, I'm also confident that they'll talk about a number of global issues on which the United States and Japan cooperate, and climate change, of course, will be one important topic in that basket. Danny, did you want to add anything to that?
With respect to the specific question, undoubtedly the president will convey, as he always has, to both the leader of Japan and the leader of Korea, the profound interest that the United States has in seeing a steady improvement in their bilateral relationship as well as in our trilateral cooperation. This directly affects U.S. strategic interests, and it directly affects the global economy. We appreciate and welcome the improvements that have been made in the bilateral Japan-Korea relationship, and we urge both leaders to continue the effort to promote lasting reconciliation.
All right, let's take the question from New York, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Paolo Mastrolilli, U.S. Bureau Chief for the Italian daily newspaper La Stampa. I have two questions, if possible, concerning the G20. The first is, since the meeting will be held in Turkey, if you know about any bilateral meeting that the President will have, apart from the one with President Erdogan, concerning the issue of ISIL and how that will be addressed during the G20 meeting. And the second question is, if you are worried about the weakening of the euro vis-à-vis the effect that it has on the American export, and if you think that will be an issue that will be addressed during the G20 as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So at the G20, we do expect the president to meet with his European counterparts to discuss a range of issues of common interest, including security issues like the one that you mentioned. On the issue of the European economy and the euro exchange rate, the President will certainly be conveying in the G20 his profound concern about the slowdown in global growth, and in particular the weak global demand. And while the European economy has shown some signs of recovery in the last year, which is welcome, we certainly believe that there's more that could be done to strengthen consumer demand in the euro area, to reduce the growing current account surplus that Europe is running. And there are a range of policies that the President will discuss with his European counterparts that could be taken to contribute to a stronger G20 and a stronger global economy.
Okay. Anybody in the back, please? Let's, right here, Barbara, please. Thanks. Yeah, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ann Lee with National Public Radio. Malaysian Prime Minister Najib is facing calls to step down amid a parade of investigations, including one from the U.S. Justice Department. How is the President of the U.S. going to address that with him, considering it's really muddled his international standing and could cost him his job?
Sure. Look, we have a constructive and positive relationship with Malaysia, and I'm sure that when the President meets with Prime Minister Najib that they'll have a productive discussion across a whole range of issues. We're aware of the allegations that you've raised, and we've seen them publicly. I don't have any comment one way or the other on any investigation, but we would look to the Malaysian authorities to conduct a full and transparent investigation of those matters that you raised. And also, if I could underscore what Assistant Secretary Russell mentioned as well, I think it would also be very natural, and I fully expect that the President will raise our concerns as well for the actions that we've seen to clamp down on civil society and silence dissent. And I think you can expect that the President will raise those issues and underscore our belief that vibrant civil societies play critically important roles in healthy democracies. And again, I think that's a point the President intends to make as well.
Okay, let's do one more here, and then we'll go to New York in the middle, please.
Thank you. This is Sakai Toyama, Ryukyu Shinpo, the Okinawa local newspaper. Okinawa Governor Onaga is just opposed to the constructing new air base in Henoko, and so President Obama has planned to meet the Prime Minister Abe this time. And so, do you think the FTEMA issue will come up to the ballot meeting this time? And also, how do you think the United States overcome to this gridlock and is still on the Henoko's relocation plan is a feasible plan?
Without a doubt, we believe that the relocation of the FTEMA Air Base to Henoko is feasible and is the best available solution from the perspective of all parties concerned. Now, of course, it is the responsibility of the government of Japan in Tokyo to see to national security policies and to work with local officials to ensure that Japan's national security interests are respected. But the United States has made very strong effort to be a good guest, to be responsive to the concerns of the based hosting communities, and to work closely not only with the national authorities, but with the local authorities in order to enhance the security, the quality of life, and the welfare generally of the people of Okinawa. We take our responsibilities as an ally seriously. We take our obligations as a guest very seriously. This is a complex issue. We approach it with great care. but also with determination, because the defense of Japan is important to us as well, and we are determined to be a good ally. That includes striking a good balance between the politics involved in the overseas operation of U.S. forces and the operational requirements that are necessary for Japan's defense.
Okay, let's take the question from New York, please.
Yes, hi, Jessica Kong from China TV Taiwan. Back on the South China Sea issue, some critics think the real meaning behind the Xi and Ma's meeting is actually China tried to legitimize expansion in South China Sea. So I wonder your reaction to that view, and relating to that, is there any role the Taiwanese government could play on this issue that is beneficial to the stability of that region? Thank you.
I'm not, candidly speaking, aware of discussion of the South China Sea between President Xi and President Ma, and I don't know whether that happened, and I don't really have a comment on that one way or the other. On the broader issue of the South China Sea, the only thing that I would say is that we look to all leaders in the region to stand together with us in defense of the larger principles that I outlined earlier, namely upholding the rules-based order, ensuring that all countries pursue their claims in accordance with international law, and that all of the disputes involved in the South China Sea are resolved peacefully in accordance with international law, including through the use of international arbitration. And I think those are the sorts of things that we'll look forward to all the region's leaders endorsing and supporting.
Okay, more quickly, please. Wait for a mic, please.
21st Century Business Herald. Thanks. On Malaysia, I wonder how would President Obama interact with Prime Minister Najib as Malaysia leaves the door open to leave TPP in the TPP text? And the second question is about accession process. Do you invite other parties from non-TPP member, but announced interest to join, including Taiwan, South Korea, Thailand, and Philippines? And do you have a timetable for accession in the future? Thanks.
We'll take that. So on the first question, I think that our primary goal is for all 12 members of TPP to ratify and implement the agreement before we have any further conversations about expansion. That is our priority, and we certainly are very interested in Malaysia remaining part of the agreement.
Could I add one comment to that I fully agree with what Rory said. That's the focus now, is on implementation and ratification. But it is gratifying to see that there is such interest in the region in the future about having other countries possibly joining TPP. So we're going to follow in priority order and get done what we need to get done immediately, which is ratify the current agreement. But it is gratifying to see that there are many other countries who have expressed interest in the TPP. There'll be a process in the months and years ahead to address those. But we've always said TPP is open to any country willing to meet its high standards, and that's the goal, is to set out a high standard agreement to which all countries in the region would aspire. And I think it's a tremendous accomplishment to have concluded this initial round. The focus now is on ratification, but I did want to make that comment about the future as well.
Okay, we'll do the front row, then New York. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dong Huiyu with China, the Real News Agency of Hong Kong. I have a follow-up question on what's new and what's not new for Assistant Secretary. Last week in New York, when you make a speech in Asia Society, you said that the United States will not accept the Chinese exceptionalism. So I think this is a pretty new idea or new concept. Could you please elaborate the Chinese exceptionalism that is not acceptable to the United States. What is the difference between the Chinese exceptionalism and the American exceptionalism that has been a reality in the international relations for a long time? Could you please elaborate that? Thank you.
Gladly. Both the United States and China are exceptional countries. But the reference that I made in my remarks was to the initiation of a new policy of declaring a security zone in international waters and of intercepting via radio ships or planes that traveled in that vicinity and warning them not to enter. That is part of a pattern of behavior that suggests that China seeks to make the Spratly Islands an exception to universal principles of international law, such as freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight, unimpeded lawful commerce. That can't be acceptable, not only to the United States, but to the broader international community, because it's so directly at odds with the trend of the times and with international law. What we would hope to see is for China not only to make its claims consistent with international law, but to seek to exercise its maritime rights in a way that is respectful of the maritime rights that everyone shares. Those are not rights that are granted by one country to another. Those are inherent rights that each of us has an obligation to respect. There are two sets of disputes in the South China Sea. One set is among the claimants over who has sovereignty over which land feature. And as my colleague said, we don't take any position whatsoever on that set of disputes, although we believe they must be resolved peacefully and in ways that are consistent with international law. But the second set of disputes is about maritime entitlements and the behavior of countries on the seas. The issue of maritime entitlements is at the heart of the case between the Philippines and China before the UNCLOS tribunal. And the issue of behavior, frankly, is what is driving a great deal of tension that we hope dialogue will abate in the near term.
Okay, let's take the question from New York, please.
Hi, this is Mehta. I am a syndicated journalist, and I also write for Bernama, the Malaysian wire service. I have actually a two-part question. The first refers to the APEC expansion. I believe India has been knocking at the door for quite some time. Do you envisage any possibility of India joining the APEC very soon? The second question pertains to the formation of the ASEAN Economic Community at the end of this year under Malaysia's chair. Do you think that this particular community could exert some kind of pressure or produce a unified stand against China in regard to the South China Sea? Thank you.
So let me take the first question. We have said in our joint vision statement with India, the President and Prime Minister Modi, that we welcome India's interest in joining APEC, and we look forward to India showing through its policies that it is committed to the same set of values and principles that have made APEC such a successful institution over the past decades.
I'm sorry, go ahead, yeah.
On the second question, the formation of the ASEAN Economic Community in 2015 is we believe the next step in an ongoing process of economic integration and promotion of connectivity in the region, but I see no direct connection between the ASEAN economic community and the issue of the South China Sea. What I think is worth clarifying is that in no way does U.S. policy aim at garnering groups against China. We are not against China. We are, however, strongly in favor of respect for international law and universal principles, and we make no secret of that.
Okay, I think we'll have two more here. Let's take it in the back, please, in the middle.
Hi, I'm Prashant with the Diplomat magazine. I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on the bilateral in the Philippines. Specifically, what might we hope to see given the fact that there's still a holdup on the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, and also the Philippine interest with TPP? There's a lot of promise in the bilateral relationship there. Thanks.
Sure. I think that, as I mentioned at the outset, President Obama looks forward to his meeting with President Aquino. I think as two close allies, they'll cover a broad range of issues, including our important economic and trade relationship. And the President would be, I'm sure, prepared to discuss anything in the economic basket of issues, including possible Filipino interest in joining the TPP. As I mentioned as well, I think you can expect that there'll be a good deal of discussion about the security side of our alliance as well, particularly our cooperation together to enhance the Philippines' maritime security. And I think you'll see through the President's events on the ground and some of the announcements he'll make, you'll see proof of our commitment to assisting our Filipino allies in that regard. Regarding EDCA, we look forward to the implementation of EDCA. We think it will help enhance alliance cooperation, our ability to further enhance the Philippine security, to respond to natural disasters and provide humanitarian assistance. I know that currently EDCA is being reviewed by the Philippine Supreme Court, and we look forward to the court's ruling on the issue. But it's very clear to us what the benefits of EDCA will be, both for the people of the Philippines and the people of the United States, and we look forward to being able to implement it in the near future.
Okay, let's have the last question, please, from here, please.
Hi, thank you. Doug Palmer with Politico Pro Trade. I just wondered, I wanted to ask about the TPP meeting with the leaders. Do you expect them to address this issue of whether to renegotiate the agreement, as at least one member of Congress has suggested could be necessary? And will there be a statement from the leaders on the TPP in terms of their hopes for how quickly they'd like to see this agreement implemented and ratified?
So there's no intention of renegotiating the agreement. That would not be possible. This was an incredibly complex agreement involving 12 countries, thousands of tariff lines, dozens of products, and incredibly complex, lengthy negotiations leading to a finely balanced agreement, which we think is very clearly in the interests of the U.S. economy, U.S. workers, U.S. businesses, U.S. farmers, as well as the other countries participating in the agreement. And the idea that this could be renegotiated is simply impossible. I have no information today about a statement that would be released at the TPP leaders meeting.
Okay, that concludes our briefing. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to our briefers, and thank you to our guests in New York.
Thank you.